Welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Colograph. Hello, I'm Peter Moore. Today we're off to South America and into the very heart of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an age of problem solving. How did the planets move? What was lightning? How far was the Earth from the Sun? Questions like these captivated figures like Newton, Franklin and Cook, as we all well know. Well, today's guest has written about a different Enlightenment puzzle in his new book, Latitude. We'll get onto that in a moment, but first of all, let me introduce Nicholas Crane. Crane is an award-winning writer, journalist and geographer. He's well known to most of us for presenting the BAFTA-winning BBC TV series Coast. Now he's taking us back on a travel through time. To be in with a chance of winning a copy of Crane's new book, do make sure that you're signed up to our mailing list on our website. Otherwise, enjoy. Welcome to Travels Through Time, and thank you very, very much for coming on.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I've given it quite a bit of thought, Peter.
Okay, well, you've got quite a story, so we're going to hopefully enjoy this and make some good sense of it. But I thought I'd start off by pointing out a fact which I don't suppose we think about very much today, but it is the fact that I am in London, and that is 51 degrees north latitude. Can you tell me what latitude is, please?
So if you imagine the Earth standing on the South Pole, so South Pole at the bottom and North Pole at the top, lines of latitude are the lines that horizontally girdle the Earth at equal intervals, whereas lines of longitude are the ones that meet at the North Pole and South Pole, and therefore they bend to allow for the curvature of the Earth. But lines of latitude are straight; they go round and round.
And why does it matter? Why is it useful for us to know?
Well, essentially, latitude and longitude are the means we've devised to create, if you like, an artificial grid that overlays the whole of the Earth's surface that we use for navigation, whether on land or on sea. So it really matters that that grid is incredibly accurate. If ships are not going to run onto reefs, then they need to be able to set a compass at a port of departure. They need to be able to sail across an ocean, and they need to arrive precisely where they're intended to on the far shore. If for any reason there are anomalies in the lines of longitude and latitude, then navigation will go awry on the way. And the complicating factor, which is related to this story in the 1730s, is that it was known at the time that Earth was not a perfect spheroid. It wasn't perfectly round. It was either stretched towards the poles or it's flattened at the equator. So it was either oblate or prolate, as it's called. And they didn't know for sure which it was. And so this expedition set off from Europe to the equator, where they planned to measure the precise length of 1 degree of latitude. And then they were going to compare that result to the length of 1 degree of latitude in the Northern Hemisphere, in the northern part of the Northern Hemisphere. They'd already measured it in France. So they were going to compare that figure with an equatorial figure. If the equatorial figure was shorter or longer, that would decide whether it's either oblate or prolate.
Was this, there's so much to analyse here. First of all, I'm going to go back to something you said a minute ago, which is about precision and how important that is. And particularly, this is in times gone by for ships at sea. And I'm sure lots of people will be thinking, along with me, about that problem of longitude. And there's this famous moment in Dava Sobel's book that she wrote 25 years ago, when there's a whole fleet which sails basically into the Scilly Isles because they do not know where they are. And so that's the problem of longitude. And I suppose for a long time, and this is probably my own ignorance, I thought that latitude was comparatively quite easy to work out. You could work out your latitude, but longitude was the place where the problem lay. And then I've come across this story of yours, which I have to admit I didn't know much about at all. And you realise that there are these two parallel stories running side by side: the search for latitude and the problem of longitude. Is that correct?
It's absolutely right. And in fact, the search to resolve the latitude issue, as they called it, the true shape of the Earth, predates John Harrison's quest to resolve the longitude question with his clocks, his accurate marine chronometers. So his final payment, the award he was given for successfully building that fifth clock, was 1773, whereas the geodesic mission to the equator that set off from France and Spain to measure latitude, they left 40 odd years before then, in 1735, to sail to the equator. So the latitude, they were both very pressing issues, and resolving them both was incredibly complicated and difficult. And what fascinated me, I mean, I'm a great fan of Dava Sebel's book. It's absolutely brilliant. And she opens it with that, as you say, with the wrecking of Sir Cloudesley, Shovel's fleet and the Scilly Isles. And
what a name! We can never forget that name as well.
Yeah, it was catastrophic, wasn't it? And but the latitude issue was both practical. It was about making navigation, sea charts and maps more accurate. But there was also something much bigger going on, which was there was a big argument, intellectual argument at the time, between the followers of Descartes and Newton. Newton produced a theory that showed that the Earth was likely to be oblate, that it was squashed at the poles, and was actually had a kind of fat waist, because the interior of the Earth, he hypothesized, was liquid, and the centrifugal force of Earth spinning was throwing the weight outwards around the equator. Whereas Descartes thought that he had empirical evidence that the opposite was true, and that Earth was sort of egg-shaped or rugby ball-shaped, and that it tapered towards the poles. So there was a big intellectual argument going on, and paradoxically, Descartes, the great French thinker, working out of Paris, was subsequently opposed by Newton working out of England. But this expedition primarily was French, and yet they supported Newton's view.
Yeah, I was going to ask, was this an argument that had separated along national lines? It doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that there's a bit of intermixing here, because sometimes we fall into these realms of scientific nationalism where the French believe one thing and the British might think another thing, and they send off their respective expeditions to prove themselves correct. But that's not the case here, is it, really?
It's not exactly a yes and no answer. I'll start by saying that actually, at the time, this was peak Enlightenment, and what we have is a kind of worldwide web of scientific interchange with great respect across national borders. So, for example, although the expedition was devised in the French Académie in the Louvre in Paris, at the time, the best instrument makers, the best makers of instruments were English in London. So the French had got used, the academicians in Paris had got used to the idea that they really wanted accurate instrumentation. They'd have to go over to London and get the latest tools to do the work from London. So the English were needed for science, although it's the French who are leading the world, actually, in terms of thinking. Now, the Spanish component of the expedition does bring in a nationalistic element, if you like, because they left Europe with 10 Frenchmen and 2 Spaniards. And the issue was that the least inconvenient place to measure 1 degree of latitude on the equator was not Africa or Southeast Asia. It was South America, which was then a Spanish dominion. Most of the continent was ruled by the Spanish, some by Portugal. But the bit they needed to go to was entirely Spanish. But the Spanish said, we will not allow a bunch of Frenchmen to go wandering for years on end around our Spanish colonies in South America, where all of our bullion ships are congregating ready to sail back to Europe, unless there are 2 Spaniards to keep an eye on them. So Seville deputized two Spanish naval lieutenants, very young, 19 and 22, who were, if you like, they were kind of special forces operatives almost. Although they were very young, they'd both both seasoned war veterans. They were very skilled seamen, very skilled navigators, and in many ways they were far more able than the 10 Frenchmen they'd been sent to keep an eye on. So there was a nationalistic element. The Spanish were eager to let the Frenchmen come to South America because they realised they were going to get some very accurate mapping out of it. The Frenchmen were going to share the results of their surveys. So Spain stood to win a lot of new scientific information about the one part of their empire that was producing unimaginable wealth, silver mainly. But also spices and all sorts of other commodities that were being shipped back to Europe, including quinine, which was the only known cure for malaria. So South America really mattered to Spain, and so they allowed this French expedition in on the conditions that they took 2 crack Spanish lieutenants with them, a team of so that made 12 scientists, 2 Spanish, 10 French. And in effect, this was the world's first international scientific expedition. So when the expedition came back, they were the toast of Paris. And Voltaire, who was a friend of one of the expedition members, like Condamine, I don't know whether you know Candide, but Candide, which was written several decades after the expedition returned, is a wonderful novelized exploration of the follies of optimism, which is precisely what this expedition's all about. And Candide has the kind of the crowning moment in Voltaire's story is when the book's optimistically misguided hero runs into very serious trouble in the high Andes of South America in precisely the same way that the geodesic mission to the equator had done 40 years earlier. So Voltaire used a lot of material from the expedition to enliven this really well-known
It was
book.
a real kind of cultural reference point for people at the time.
Yeah, exactly. It was, Peter. It's exactly what it was. It became a cultural reference point, exactly. And oddly enough, one of the most dangerous elements of the whole expedition, which lasted for 10 years, was not so much the frostbite or getting robbed, both of which happened, but the river crossings. And if anyone who's done a lot of mountaineering or travelling through big wild country, and I've done I once walked from side to side across Europe on my own through the mountains, and I've done big treks in India Kush and Afghanistan and places. And actually in big mountains where you have a lot of snow melt, the real danger is not frostbite or even avalanches, which you can predict, but getting swept away during river crossings. River crossings are very scary because there are very seldom bridges. And this was an era when the scientists were travelling to remote mountain tops where they'd set up their survey stations so frequently they were having to cross rivers that had no bridges. And of course, with snowmelt and thaws in the spring, you had simply stupendous volumes of water. Very scary.
And I think, to me, of course, when you think of exploration in South America, the first person who leaps to mind, in fact, would be Alexander von Humboldt. But we're talking about, almost a century before. 80 years before or something like this. This is quite a long way back. But it is, as you say, a time when this idea of the surveyor is really coming into, it's kind of fashionable thing to be. I suppose we have to remember that George Washington trained as a surveyor not long after this. It's kind of how he started out. So it was kind of a new and exciting profession. So
immensely exciting, yeah.
Let's go to your year then. We've touched on the voyage. We've talked a little bit about the context of the history, but I'm going to ask you the question now, which hopefully will send us tumbling off into the past. If you could go back to a single year in the past, which one would you pick?
This gave me a lot of strife, Peter, because the expedition lasted for 10 years, and any one of the years I just kept going, choosing one year, then thinking, no, I can't do that, another even better one. So in the end, I went for 1739.
Okay.
So we are 4 years after they left Europe.
Let's just talk about 1739 in a broad sense before we go. Just from something you earlier said, this is high Enlightenment, and it might be just interesting for you to kind of talk about the Enlightenment as a moment in history and what people were trying to achieve then. What was happening?
There's a wonderful flowering of intellectual curiosity which spread right across the humanities and the sciences, and it manifested itself in many different ways. So in Paris, you had the French Académie of Sciences. It was the most prestigious organization to belong to at the time. You had to be invited. There were different orders within it. You got promoted depending on your value as a scientist, although actually one of the members of this expedition managed to get promotion on what were clearly false pretenses. I mean, ended up being the leader of the expedition completely disastrously. But that's another story. In terms of the applied science, then it really was about exploring gravity. It was about exploring metallurgy. There are a lot of new minerals being discovered and experimented with. Mercury was a key element that was being used at the time and was known to exist in South America, and as of course was silver. And during this expedition, they made the first European description of rubber and platinum. So the curiosity manifested itself right the way across the board, from Voltaire's poems and novels to the hard science, the hard applied science that people like Newton and Huygens had put forward. So this was by far the biggest Enlightenment scientific expedition that had ever sailed the seven seas, and they took with them from London the most advanced scientific instruments. So the English responded with alacrity. I mean, they were paid to provide the instruments, but these were cutting edge instruments that were going to be used in the high Andes in a way that had never been used before. And they took with them, and this again is very much a kind of an Enlightenment tick. They took with them their own instrument maker, a clockmaker called Ugo.
Oh, that's very interesting.
And so he of the 12 men that left Europe, one of them was, if you like, he was a master craftsman, but he was the geek, the technology expert. He was the
Q character.
The Q character. In an age of hardware, he was nowadays he'd be a software geek, but back then he was a hardware geek, and he found himself not just repairing barometers and quadrants and compasses and all of the equipment, the crates and crates of equipment they took from Europe, but towards the tail end of the expedition, after they'd completed the survey on the ground, when they had to lock this great chain of virtual triangles to the sky, to the stars, in order to fix it celestially, he had to build a horribly complicated instrument called a zenith sector, which measured the height of a star above the horizon. And very complicated, with immensely long 10, 12, 16-foot telescopes. And this device was so big, you had to build an observatory to house it in. So poor Ugo, working in a little atelier in a workshop somewhere in Quito, was having to construct incredibly fragile, delicate, complicated scientific instruments. When there wasn't enough, he didn't have access to lots of copper and brass and silver for welding. All of these raw materials had to be gathered in. He had to be able to turn screw threads on a little lathe, or melt copper and brass but forge iron. So he was a key component of the whole expedition. I might also mention, another kind of Enlightenment specialist was of course map maker. You couldn't run an expedition like this without having a professional map maker, because and for this they had a very able French marine cartographer they brought from the port of Toulon. He was one of the oldest people on the expedition, but very solid, very capable, had a track record in making accurate maps and charts. And one of the first jobs he had when they arrived in South America was to map this great central valley between the two chains of volcanoes that they were going to spend the next few years working down. Because until they'd mapped the precise locations of the volcanoes, they couldn't start planning this survey. So before they could even start, they had to make their own maps. So you can see it's a big, elaborate expedition.
It is, and I mean, you describe right through the first portions of the book how arduous the journey is after they leave in 1735 and all the hardships that they encounter. There's strange animals, there's even stranger diseases, there's lots of bickering among the crew or the expedition members. And it's, it all just kind of canters along in a way that you would imagine would combust at any moment, but it kind of doesn't. And we get to 1739, and I think now is the moment that you could take us to your first of your three scenes, please.
Yeah, so we have to imagine that it took them a year to get there. So by kind of mid-1736, they're on site in Quito. They then spend the next 3 years overcoming a number of problems, like running out of money. They accidentally murdered somebody, and they lay out this chain of triangles from north to south, using mountain tops as the stations on which they place their quadrant, the instrument they're using to measure angles on these triangles. And they, after 3 years of doing this, they're nearing the southern end of the proposed chain. They've nearly measured 3 degrees of latitude, and from this they're going to compute the precise length on the ground of 1 degree. But the mountains, unfortunately, are getting progressively more remote. And this is a problem because where the mountains are packed together and remote, they have great trouble placing signals, as they call them, on mountain tops that could be seen from other mountain tops. Because without GPS or pre-existing accurate maps, it's very difficult to work out in advance exactly where you're going to set up your survey station. So they'd repeatedly go up a mountaintop and find the signals on the peak they were trying to measure the angle to had been blown down or stolen by locals for its timber and canvas. So they start again. So eventually, on April the 17th, by mid-April, they've nearly completed all the difficult peaks. They've nearly survived. And then comes a peak called Sinus Aguan, which they climb on April the 17th, 1739. And they've nearly finished. It's a very high remote peak, and they get caught by one of the characteristic Andes storms that sweeps up out of nowhere. And I've been in them. They're ferocious. They're very cold, very high winds, big gusts, and the tent gets smashed to pieces. They'd commissioned a special kind of expedition tent that had made on the way out, great big thing. That gets smashed to pieces. They put up another tent, that gets smashed to pieces. The local helpers who they've employed as porters to both bring food up to them at these remote camps and to help them find the way, they desert. They've had enough, quite understandably. Hypothermia. They're not properly equipped to deal with storms, and the local people in the Andes were well aware that these storms were often fatal, and what you don't do is just sit on a mountaintop waiting them to blow out. You go straight down to lower altitudes. But the scientists had to stay at the top because they hadn't completed their measurements. So a third tent gets destroyed, and they're really hanging on by the skin of their teeth.
Do you think this is the moment of maximum crisis during this mountainous expedition?
A fatality at that point could have been really disastrous. All it would have taken would have been for one of them to slip over a precipice or fall into a ravine or get lost and die of hypothermia. And of course, losing, with that passing, you'd lose notebooks, equipment, scientific instruments. Somehow they persevered. They got the measurements, and they appeared out of this storm. And the villagers in Kenya who had been praying for them were completely gobsmacked. They could not believe their eyes that these Europeans had come down from the mountain out of this storm and they were still alive. They could have packed up, but they didn't. They just kept going. And they managed to complete, even after that horrendous storm with all their equipment smashed, they kept the survey going and completed it later that year.
It really speaks to this... I don't know, the human spirit in some ways, but it connects as well with this tradition within science at that time of just how far people were willing to go to put their bodies. I mean, Newton himself would experiment on himself, in ways that were quite dangerous. And if you've read the Richard Holmes's Age of Wonder, or even later on, there's lots of people who do self-experimentation with drugs and so on. This long tradition of science and peril running close by, but this seems like a real moment of danger. And when you think about it in terms of mountain climbing in the early 18th century without any good protective gear to protect them, and without any real understanding of the effect of altitude on the human body, it does become quite something, doesn't it? What kind of, do you know, did you manage to work out what kind of clothing they had in this environment?
Yeah, there were. I mean, there are odd references. They were basically wearing local Andean wools. Your classic poncho is what was commonly worn, and cloaks. They had leather footwear, but they were not well equipped and by modern standards, and were, among other things, always one of the greatest hazards when they're up in the mountains was getting lost, because they didn't have accurate large scale maps. You know, nowadays you can navigate either with GPS, or if you've got a large scale ordnance survey map in Britain, you can navigate to within 10 meters just using a handheld compass. Well, they didn't have large scale accurate maps, so they were absolutely dependent on local guides, shepherds or whoever, who would show them the secret routes up and down these mountains. So if they got separated from the guides, they're in dead trouble. And there were several occasions when, most kind of graphically described by one of the team members, my hero, kind of maverick called La Condamine, who is a great friend of Voltaire's. And La Condamine, actually, you mentioned Newton doing experiments on himself. La Condamine eventually died in his bed, not very comfortably, back in Paris. He survived the expedition, but he died because he subjected himself to an experimental hernia operation. So classic example of what you're talking about. I mean, their curiosity could be fatal. But La Condamine, on one of the times he recorded in great detail, he'd tried to climb, really, he'd been up it many times already, a mountain called Pichincha, the Vesuvius of Quito, and he got caught in a terrible storm. His guide turned around and went back down. He was on his own. He had all he had was the clothes he stood up in and a mule, and he became so cold overnight, because actually the real risk, as many mountaineers will know, particularly in Britain, is that if you get soaked to the skin and then you get cold, it is really, really difficult to get through the night, and that's exactly what happened to La Condamine. And he ended up, he couldn't sleep, of course. He managed to find a clump of the tall, wiry grass that grows on the paramo on the mountainsides in what's now Ecuador, where they were, and put himself on top of that for a bit of insulation. But he became so cold in the night that he had to urinate on his own feet to stop them freezing solid. And that was a kind of quite an intelligent thing to do. Would have got him through another 20 minutes probably before they then started freezing solid again. But he was in such a terrible state that by the time dawn came, because of course without a torch, he had no electric torches, so he couldn't move at night. His only recourse to survival the next morning was to descend a mountain. And fortunately he found a local hut, staggered inside, and was revived in front of a fire. And then amazingly, classic example of what you're talking about, Peter, he went back to Quito, got some new gear, and set off again the next morning and climbed a mountain, as if it was just like a.
I like your description. I like your description of fatal curiosity. I think that would be a good title for another book, maybe about this whole, kind of tradition. But
Yes.
You did say before that you'd been traveling and walking in the Andes. Is there anything from your own personal experience that kind of sheds light on what they encountered? Because it seems, I mean, I've not been to South America. I've not been to the Andes, but the weather systems there must be quite sudden and very, kind of difficult to enjoy. Is that right?
Yes, I mean you've got a number of things working against you. You've got sudden changes of weather. You've got altitude, so thin air, and you've got very low nighttime temperatures, and those three things combined can really throw you. And actually, when I was there, so this is the early 80s, on this particular trip I think you're referring to, there weren't even accurate maps. I had no maps, and rather foolishly, I suggested to my then girlfriend, now my wife, that we do a 3 or 4 day mountain trek through the Andes. I had got a compass, but not a map, because there weren't any available, and food was quite hard to come by. We didn't have a tent, so I bought 2 plastic bin bags from a hardware store in a village, and so we're going to sleep inside these bin bags. But which indeed is what we did. But it was so cold that you can't really sleep through the night in a bin bag in the Andes. And they were full of ice.
I'm surprised she married you. Actually,
well,
exactly.
It wasn't a very
interesting. Well, I suppose after that, then everything else will seem quite straightforward in a way. But there was one of a question I just wanted to reconcile before we move on, because it's so interesting. We did touch on it before, but it goes back to this technical business of triangulation, which is what they were essentially doing and what was driving them up to these observation points. And as far as I just wanted to describe it so it's kind of vivid to the listener, it involves having this initial baseline and then taking points of triangulation, which then taper out in a kind of jigsaw puzzle across space. And that's it really, isn't it?
In a nutshell, exactly. You've got Euclidean trigonometry tells you that if you've got the length of one side of one triangle, you can work out the lengths of the other two sides by measuring the internal angles, which of course all add up to 180 degrees. So using very simple ancient trigonometry, they decided to lay out a virtual chain of triangles over a distance of more than 200 miles, which would span more than 3 degrees of latitude. But to measure the angles, the internal angles of these triangles, they could only do that if they used high points, because of course you've got to be able to see the point that you're trying to measure between, the 2 points you're trying to measure between with your quadrant. So that meant using mountain peaks. Well, triangulation had been described really frequently and as a well-used method of cartographic surveying. In fact, Gemma-Frisius in the Low Countries had first described it in the early 1500s and he said what you do is climb to the top of church towers and measure the angles between adjacent church towers and lay your triangles out like that. Well, that's all very well in a flat as a pancake land like the Low Countries, but in the high Andes, church towers are ridiculous. So they used mountain tops, which were much, much further apart. So what they would do is to erect what they called a signal on the mountain top, a lime-painted triangle of timber and canvas. After a while, they switched to using white tents because the pyramids kept getting blown away. And then they'd measure the angle using a quadrant between two peaks, the white little dot. All they would be able to see through the telescope would be two minute white dots. So you had to have absolutely clear weather. And then after many years of laying out all these triangles, they could use simple trigonometry to calculate the length of every side of all the triangles and therefore the overall length of the chain of triangles.
It's a wonderful thing just from that initial baseline. And I think it was worth clarifying that because this was obviously the great driver that made them climb the mountains. Let's move on to your second scene, which is not long after. Do you want to take us to that? Because we were in April, on the 17th of April before. Where are we now? And,
yes, so April 17th, 1739, we're stuck on top of a peak called Sinus Aguin with our tents smashed to pieces. 3 weeks later, they're on the next peak, a much lower peak, called Buran, and the weather is appalling. The cloud is too low to be able to see the peaks they've got to measure the angles between. So La Condamine, who is this maverick friend of Voltaire's and probably the most, to my mind, fascinating of the French academicians, decides that he's going to fulfill a long-held curiosity and undertake effectively the first European survey of an Inca site, a site that had been constructed during the time of the Inca Empire, because he can see it from this awful peak they're stuck on. It's not many miles away. It's on a rib of upland between two ravines. He can see the ruins. He knows it's Inca site because the local people call it the Inca Walls. So rather than just stay in the tent, for yet another day in the cloud and the rain, he goes with his companion, rides on mules across the valley to Inca Pirca, as it's now known. It's probably the most famous, in fact, it is the most famous Inca tourist site in Ecuador now. And he conducts this incredibly accurate, detailed survey of this temple fortress complex. And it's absolutely fascinating because, he's bringing his geodesy that's been devised for measuring enormous spans of the Earth's surface. They're measuring 200 miles of the Andes very, very accurately. But in this occasion, he's measuring sort of 200 meters of archaeology. Incredibly carefully, he draws sketches and maps it, takes the measurements. And then he becomes so intrigued by Inca Pirca that the next time the clouds cover the mountain and they can't see to do the survey, he rides back to Inca Pirca again to continue the measurements. And then he writes a paper that becomes really quite widely circulated back in France and is celebrated now for being a groundbreaking Inca survey. And one of the kind of, he describes it with quite excitement in his journal, going over there, quite a lot of excitement. And one of the asides he makes, which sort of brought me up with a start, is that he sees a local farmer dismantling the Inca temple, removing the stones from the Inca temple to build his farm. I mean, amazing. To actually have witnessed the destruction. So, it was a first-hand account of how these great Inca temples and fortresses disappeared from the landscape, because there are many, many, many of them that have gone completely. They just don't exist, and the stones have been recycled. Because, as you know, the Inca stonework was unparalleled. It was unmortared. It fitted together so snugly that you wouldn't be able to push a knife blade between the stones, and they're all beveled. The geometry was perfect. This particular temple complex was oriented so that the sun would shine into an inner chamber during the solstices, and so it was I chose May the 20th, 1739, because the survey of Inca Pirca was one example of their sort of extracurricular enthusiasms that all members of the expedition pursued through the whole decade. So they looked into quinine as a cure for malaria. They did many experiments on gravity. They made the first European description of rubber, described the use of balsa wood for rafts and boats. There were just all of these curiosities were carefully noted in their notebooks, and many of them were written up for the French Academy when they got back to Paris.
Yeah, it is absolutely quintessential of that Enlightenment sensibility that you wouldn't kind of put your feet up and have a day's rest. You'd kind of do something else if the opportunity arose, and it's just so striking. I've written about Joseph Banks, who in a way is like kind of an echo of Le Condamine in a way, because he was always like eyes open, always looking outward, no moment for kind of internal reflection as we kind of have in the 21st century, where we're kind of in interior sensibility really. But they're like so interested in the outside world and how this angle might rise, or how this might fit together with that.
Banks he's an extraordinary character. I mean,
he is, but there's shades, aren't there? There's shades of similarity between the two of them, but they both kind of belong to this like kind of desire to, I don't know, just use up every moment with something which is productive observation, and that's really striking. But also to go along on May the 20th, 1739 would be quite fun, because you're essentially, although we are part of this great Enlightenment project, you are rubbing up against another great history, the history of the Incas, which is fading perhaps at that point, and I think that's the magic of this scene, isn't it?
It is. It's impossible to underestimate how intoxicated Europeans were by the Incas, because of course there'd been a number of very detailed accounts brought back by the conquistadors in the 16th century about the conquest of the Inca Empire, and unbelievably brutally, and indeed the Incas had brutally conquered an earlier empire. So it's a saga of episodic bloodshed. But So but for Europeans of the 18th century, the one thing that everybody knew on every street corner about the Incas was their fabulous wealth. The gold, the jewelry, the great hoards that had been hidden by Atahualpa when the conquistadors came over the horizon. They were meant to be enormous stashes of treasure all over the Andes.
And well, there's something that's important to note at this point, which connects both of our first two scenes, is that there was, of course, this core of European explorers or expedition members, but they were supported by this larger apparatus of indigenous people from the locale, weren't they? Which is something you write about in the book.
Yes, it's a very bleak absence because they're not ever named, and yet we know that if you're going to carry a quadrant and food for 3 weeks and barometers, telescopes, compasses, and all that to the top of a mountain in the Andes, then you're going to have a lot of porters, a lot of people to help you get up there. And there are references in the journals to porters being used, to local guides being used, and so on. We never learn their names, and they're paid. They are paid, and indeed there are references to them being paid over the going rate simply to motivate them to help. But on many occasions they bailed out or just refused to help. So they weren't desperate to be subjected to the vicissitudes of mountaineering. And of course this was also at the height of the slave trade. And several of the expedition members had bought slaves in the Caribbean on the way out to Peru. But again, these individuals are not named, and they're barely mentioned because there was a sort of aggrandizement, a heroic self-image at the time that science was pushing, that the academicians from Paris were achieving this on their own, that this was their route to fame and fortune, and that in a way the local helpers, without whom they couldn't operate it at all, were actually slightly in the way in terms of the narrative. So they don't make it into the journals aside from being enumerated now and again. And there's only one slave who gets mentioned by name, a man called Granger, and he, interestingly enough, he picks up so much knowledge about cartography, about map making during the expedition that he becomes, when he's eventually released on his own island, what became Haiti, he became the surveyor, the island surveyor. So he came back, if you like, with raised social standing. But it's difficult. I really struggled with it. I didn't know how.
I think it's one of these things that we all who write in about the history of science, and it might be that women in science in the 19th century, or kind of indigenous peoples in centuries before that. But one thing's absolutely for sure, this was a logistical challenge that would not have been possible without considerable, kind of support from porters, as you said before. And I think it's just it's one of those parts of the story we can't really expose it too much, because it's not written, it's there, it's in the margins, but it's certainly a case and a point, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've had first-hand experience of working with local experts, local people. I made a long horse trek through the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan during the war, and there's no possibility I could have done that without the two Afghan horsemen I was with. I mean, not a chance. I'd have been a goner in 5 minutes.
Hello, it's Artemis. At Travels Through Time, we're incredibly proud to be partnering with Jordan Lloyd and Colourgraph. Jordan is one of the world's leading visual historians. Through his excellent craftsmanship, he brings black and white photographs of the past to life in startling colour and clarity. Jordan's extraordinary work, as well as that of his contemporaries, can be found on the website colourgraph.co. At colourgraph.co, you'll be able to explore the process and history behind the colorization work, but most excitingly of all, you can also buy some of these beautiful photographs as museum-grade fine art prints. They make an unusual and striking present for that friend or family member of yours who loves the past, and they're an excellent addition to any room. Whether it's a colorized photograph of the US Capitol building from 1846, or a candid shot of the Beatles from 1964, you're pretty sure to find something that enchants you. I know I certainly have many times. It's hard to explain really over audio just how cool these prints are, so I encourage you to have a look for yourself at colourgraph.co. What's more, Travels Through Time listeners get 10% off when they enter the code TTT at the checkout.
Such a fashion, and this is where history often takes us to nowadays, but we have to keep moving, and we've got one more scene to squeeze in, and we're going to move a little bit further through 1739. Where are we going to go to for your third and final scene, please?
We're going to the end of August the 29th, in, they call it the city of Cuenca, but really it was more of a town, and it's the annual fiesta. So they've completed at last this epic triangulation survey. They've measured all the triangles they need to, and they think all they've got to do now is take a number of accurate astronomical observations that could have been accomplished in a few weeks. In fact, it took many years more. But that's to jump ahead. It's August the 29th. They've got to Cuenca. They're in a very celebratory mood because they've all survived the mountains except for one man who died of disease. So there's 11 left. They've made it to Cuenca and it's fiesta time. But this disparate dozen of the Enlightenment had a habit of sabotaging their own expedition whenever they had the opportunity. And on this occasion, one of their number, the surgeon, Seneg, seemed to have been having a relationship with a local woman who'd just been jilted by her lover, who was in the local civic authorities. And one thing led to another, and the two men ended up having an argument in the square. They were both drunk, and they both drew their pistols and fell over into the gutter before managing to fire them. But then a couple of days later at the fiesta, the French surgeon spots his adversary over in the stands, and cut a long story short, an altercation kicks off, and it is in the bullring. So you've got a drunken Frenchman, waving his pistol around in the bullring. The militia are called, and 100 armed men rush into the bullring with pikes and so on, and see a Frenchman. Everybody in the bullring knows exactly who he is because the scientists have been fairly notorious for misbehaving. And they chase him out of the ring, but he is determined not to go, so he's waving his cutlass, and he gets slashed in the hand, drops his pistol, and then gets stabbed in the spleen with the long, sharp blade that's used to dispatch the bull. And over the next 3 days, he bleeds to death. So the murder of the expedition surgeon, in a sense, it wouldn't have been, although it's obviously a tragedy for him, it wouldn't have impeded the scientific aims of the expedition had La Condamine, the maverick, not been his executor and close friend. And La Condamine took the murder so personally that it distracted him from science for the next 2 or 3 years, and he got involved in epic legal battles with the Spanish authorities to try and bring the murderers to justice. In fact, they described it as a full-on riot. It wasn't just the murder of one man. All of the scientists had to run for their lives through the streets.
Yeah, it's high drama. It's like an Almodovar film kind of at the end. And you realise when everyone's getting drunk and having affairs and, kind of arguing at fiestas. And it's quite combustible, really, isn't it?
Yes, it is. They've all got trigger fingers, and part of that's because La Condamine was a war veteran himself. Both the two Spanish lieutenants, there were 2 Spaniards and 10 Frenchmen initially. They were although they were very young, just 19 and 22 when they left Spain. They'd both been at war themselves and were called away to war during the expedition. So it was an era of problems being resolved with a sword and a pistol. But having said that, I've probably overplayed that a bit in the way we've been talking over the last few minutes, because there other members of the expedition were very keenly aware of the need for diplomacy, and for all of their faults, and in particular Condamine's faults, he did make a trip the whole way to Lima to meet the viceroy and to smooth things over and make sure that the expedition could proceed and to gather funds and so on. So they all knew that they had to work with the Spanish authorities. And paradoxically, on the expedition, it wasn't so much the French who were working against the authorities, but the two Spanish members of the expedition who were compiling a secret dossier on human rights issues in the Spanish colonies. They'd been told to do that by the government in Seville. And the report wasn't published for long after they died, but their written report is now available, and it's absolutely fascinating.
It's quite a layered scene.
It is very layered, exactly.
Watching everybody else. I mean, I say if we could be there as well, but I don't know what effect to British people would have in that. It'd be probably too much for the culture to bear. I think we'd be in trouble as well. But it's it's just fascinating, this idea of a fiesta in Cuenca. Could I just do a little bit of geography, because they always talk about this is in modern day Ecuador. That's right, isn't it? But
absolutely,
back then they talk about it as being part of Peru. Is that correct as well? Is that how the geography was realised back then?
Yes. So there were more than one viceroyalty in South America. The viceroyalty of Peru was enormous and stretched right the way down the coast of what is now Ecuador and South America, and also a long way inland over the Andes Mountains to the headwaters of the Amazon. So it was a huge territory, and it was divided up in a very efficient colonial manner into local departments, local districts that were all run by local headmen, invariably corrupt. And you couldn't, it was rather like you almost had to, they had to have a Spanish passport to travel there at all, but they had to have permission from each of these little local heads to move through their territory as well. So it was quite, moving around, it was quite complicated, because you couldn't move in what was then South America through the Viceroyalty of Peru, whose capital was Lima. It's where the Viceroy actually was based, which was a long way. It's about 6 weeks riding south of Quito, so a long way south if you wanted to go and have a chat to Viceroy. Very difficult journey too. So you had to have the diplomatic connections to operate, and bearing in mind that at local level, you've already alluded to it, Peter, that the local people had no understanding of Enlightenment science. So what they saw were a bunch of pale-skinned Europeans hunting around in the mountains using strange instruments, almost certainly, as they believed, looking for Inca gold. So everybody just assumed they were treasure hunters, which of course, and treasure hunters were not, the favourite flavour in the Andes at the time. And it was one of the reasons that there were so many misunderstandings. In fact, Condamine at the end of, at the end of the expedition after 10 years, he decides to, in character, he's a wonderfully exuberant madman, really. Rather than just do the simple thing and take a ship back from the port of Lima, Callao, back to Europe, he decides to descend the entire length of the Amazon on a homemade balsa raft. But on the way over the Andes to get in his raft, a group of assassins are sent out to kill him for all the trouble he's been causing over the chasing the people in the authorities in Cuenca about the murder of his friend. But luckily, by chance, he'd just gone on an alternative route, so the assassins missed him, and he went straight past without knowing, and didn't find out till later. But so yeah, there were, but he many times he may not have made it, and as all of them, well, two of them didn't make it. One of disease, one of murder.
Well, I should ask you then. The obvious question is that what was the ultimate success of the expedition? Was it did they achieve what they hoped to in defining the shape of the globe?
Yeah, they came back with a definitive number. While they'd been in South America on the equator, another French expedition set off to the Arctic, north of the Gulf of Bothnia, and measured the length of 1 degree of latitude there, which caused great alarm to the mission in South America because they thought they'd been bounced. But actually, the length of the survey they did, which covered 3 degrees, was so much more accurate, and it was also on the equator, where, as they discovered, the Earth does indeed bulge, as Newton had theorised. So they came back with a precise number. They proved that the Earth had indeed got a bulging waist, that it was kind of pumpkin-shaped, and that it didn't taper towards the poles. It was oblate, an oblate sphere. And so in the abstract sense, the mission was entirely successful. What they did also was to make some progress towards measuring the actual curvature of the Earth at the equator, which is also quite important, not just the overall shape, but the actual curvature. But then they came back with all this other information too on rubber and quinine and platinum and archaeology and human rights and so on. And I think that was the true story. And in a sense, the geodesic number was a bit of a byproduct of something much grander, which was a collaborative international scientific expedition that we need so desperately now. I mean, the pandemic could not have been, we couldn't have come up with solutions to this pandemic without international scientific collaboration, and this was the world's first
and that's one thing when we reflect on 18th century science, that despite it being a century full of wars, as the First World War in a way, with the 7 Years' War and all the others that followed, there was a lot of collaboration between the Académie in Paris and the Royal Society in Britain, and this kind of great network of scientists that was envisaged. So it is something for us to think about today. But I was just looking over at the subtitle of your book, and I'm appreciating the pun of the astonishing adventure that shaped the world. What a wonderful pun that is. Exactly. I've got one last question now before we let you back to 2021. If you could bring back a memento, tangible object, something to remind you of our discussion about 1739, if you could have it with you, what would you like?
Well, I don't know whether for certain Le Condamine had it with him in 1739, but he had a notebook stolen just in the year before he came back, 1744. And it was a notebook describing the volcano Pichincha, and I'd love to have a flick through that. It was stolen from his room in Quito. But if you won't allow me that, because I can't be convinced he had it with him in 1739, then I'll settle for the quadrant that he definitely had on top of Sinusaga and the peak that he got smashed by the storm on. So the quadrant, this incredible device that can be both used for measuring the angles between peaks, but also the height of objects like mountains. And
probably an object that was in daily use almost throughout the expedition. It was just intensively used, wasn't it? And they'd be quite lost without it. Sorry for another one, but an essential thing. So a really, really good choice. Oh, I've enjoyed this. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation about a bit of history, which I should know more about, but I feel like I've filled in a bit of a gap. Latitude really, really gallops along as a narrative. You start with the ship sailing out of France, and we're then in the Caribbean, we're then in South America, and all the time it's kind of high octane stuff. So I'm sure it will be eagerly gobbled up by readers. Thank you very much, Nicholas Crane, for coming on Travels Through Time.
That's very kind of you, Peter. Thank you.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Nicholas Crane about his new book, Latitude, which captures a great moment of Enlightenment exuberance. It's a fabulous story too, of course. Remember, we are giving away a couple of hardback copies of the book, so do go to our website at tttpodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter if you want to be in with a chance of winning one. Thank you for listening today. We'll be back as ever next Tuesday. Until then, goodbye.